Hi everyone, thanks very much for meeting so early for many of you, and I guess it's just a different coffee hour. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. So, as Meg said, my name's Sam. I'm a professor of creative pedagogies at Edinburgh Napier University. My background is I have an undergraduate and master's degree in physics with space science and technology, and my PhD is in atmospheric physics. And after doing my PhD, I then did the usual step of going to Japan and spending 2 years looking at the intersections between science and theatre and working in the Saitama Theatre under Yukio Ninigawa, and kind of realized that I like doing science, but I was maybe a better communicator than I was a scientist. So I then was very fortunate to get tenure relatively early in my career as an assistant professor in science communication at Manchester Metropolitan University, and kind of developed a lot of my work around using poetry, which is what the focus of today's talk will be, and also games as a way to develop dialogues between scientists and non-scientists, and in particular to help diversify and democratize science. And then, yeah, gone, I don't know, through the academic ranks, so to speak, and now I'm a full professor at Edinburgh Napier. So there's my contact details. Really looking forward to talking today. Like, it's very informal. There'll be loads of time for questions at the end, but for people who feel unable to answer questions or answer questions rather, feel free to drop me an email at any time or reach out to me via my website or Blue Sky as well. And the QR code at the top just takes you to a link of my various stuff. So today, really, then, what I want to focus on is why we might use poetry as a way to communicate or talk about science to different audiences. And I want to start off by offering an abstract, I guess, in the form of a poem. So this is a poem that was written by Richard Brautigan. So Richard Brautigan, for people who don't know, is one of the most celebrated beat poets, American beat poets of the 1960s, of like a similar generation to Kerouac and Ginsberg. And in 67, the summer of love, Brautigan spent 6 months as the poet in residence at Caltech, which, I think must have been amazing, right? Like, what an amazing time to be a poet in residence at one of the leading scientific institutes in the world. And he was there for 6 months, I guess, observing, eating, hanging out with the scientists. And this is the poem that he wrote. I don't care how goddamn smart these guys are. I'm bored. It's been raining like hell all day long, and there's nothing to do. And that's it. That's all he wrote. And at first, I looked at that and I was like, typical poet working at Caltech for 6 months, probably getting paid quite a lot of money, and he writes 4 lines. But then you look at it and it's like, wow. And what I take from this is, if Richard Brautigan, who's, unarguably one of the greatest literary minds of the mid 20th century, he went to Caltech, which in the 60s must have been so interesting. And this is what he took from it. So what that tells me is that if, as a scientist, you are communicating your work in such a way that Richard Brautigan is writing about it like this, maybe there's something slightly amiss with the way that you're talking about science. And the other thing as well is that it really cuts through to the power of poetry. In 4 lines, Brautigan says what other people have taken textbooks to write, that maybe scientists need to have a little think about the way that they communicate science in a way that could make it more engaging. So that's kind of the abstract I'm basing this around, the role that poetry can and indeed should play in potentially communicating science. I just want to also start off by saying what poetry is not, because one of the biggest challenges I always get, rightly, is people say to me, Sam, your work is around trying to diversify and democratize science, make it more diverse and be more accessible for more diverse groups of people. So why are you choosing poetry, which, you know, like science, has many issues in terms of being perceived as being exclusive and exclusionary? And that is a very fair comment. And a lot of the work that I do is around trying to break down those barriers of actually poetry kind of is for everyone. And part of the reason why people feel that poetry is not for everyone is quotes like these. So these are three quotes about what poetry is, from very well-known, celebrated poets. So Shelley, you know, one of the most, if not the most celebrated English poets from the Romantic period, tells us that poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. Okay, cool. Adrienne Rich, you know, amazing poet, feminist, thought leader. She tells us that poems are like dreams. In them, you put what you don't know, you know. Okay, I'm just about along with that still. And then Carl Sandburg tells us, Carl Sandburg, 3 times Pulitzer Prize winner, Carl Sandburg. He tells us that poetry is the journal of a sea animal living on land, wanting to fly in the air. At which point I think it's not though, is it, Carl? You're just being silly there. These are words that don't make any sense. And a lot of times people encounter poetry and poems that are so alienating that they really feel as though they're not for them. And certainly when I think, you know, to the way that we're taught about poetry in Western classrooms, a lot of the times we're introduced to poetry written by dead white men from like the 1500s, which some of which is very beautiful, but not all of which is particularly relevant to ourselves or our identities. So I want to offer an alternative vision of what poetry is, written by a far less celebrated, successful, and certainly remunerated poet, myself. And that is that poetry is whatever it means to you and how it relates to your needs, your experiences, and your understanding. And even though this is a science communication talk, if you take one thing away from this whole talk, it's this, right? It's that nobody knows what a poem is about. The only person who knows what a poem is about is the poet. But the poet doesn't know you. And the poet doesn't know every single thing in your life that has led up to that moment in time of you reading the poem. Your lived experiences, your memories, your life. So your interpretation and what you take from the poem is no more or less correct than anyone else's. It's just different. And this is not to denigrate the work of English language or creative writing professors. You know, it's just they bring additional or different context when they're interpreting. So it's okay for you to love other poems that people hate. It's okay for you to hate other poems that people love. The way you encounter a poem will be different, like on a Monday to a Friday. Like certainly poems that I loved in my youth, I don't really care for now. Poems that I struggled with in my youth, I really love now. And that's how we can start to break down these barriers of people willing to engage with poetry, to really encourage them that actually it's okay to have your own thoughts and feelings about those poems, and then to work with those communities to find poems that speak with them and to them. So in terms of how this fits in science communication, so science communication can really, academically speaking, if we think about it existing as a spectrum, so this is a non-hierarchical spectrum. It's just saying that there's different elements, none of which are better than the other, they're just different. So on one end of the spectrum, we would have dissemination. So this is the communication, the one-way exchange of ideas. So it's me as a scientist explaining about science to a non-scientist or a non-scientific audience. And then further along the spectrum, we have dialogue, which is a two-way exchange of knowledge or information. So this would be scientists and non-scientists talking about work, but not just the scientist saying, this is work that I've done, isn't it cool? But instead thinking, what do you care about as a non-scientific audience? What are your experiences? What are your needs? And how can I use that to help develop and direct my future research? So that's this kind of two-way exchange of knowledge and ideas. And then the third side will be participation, which is when we get non-scientists to actually participate in scientific research. So most obviously through citizen science projects. Another great example is actually, through Wikipedia and things like that, of people actually being involved in that process of helping to democratize and develop scientific thought and communication. So how we communicate science exists on this spectrum, and it's not saying that dissemination is worse than participation, it's just saying it's different. They all have their different needs as well. For example, blogs, podcasts, wildlife documentaries, they're all excellent examples of dissemination that can have a really positive and profound impact on the way in which science is communicated and developed going further as well. And I guess what I'm going to try and argue over the next 20 minutes or so is that poetry can play a really powerful part in all three aspects of this spectrum, from dissemination through to dialogue and then on to participation as well. So in terms of dissemination, and I'll give you, I guess, some case studies from my own work. I have a blog called The Poetry of Science, where every week I read a piece of scientific research and try to write a poem about it to communicate that science to a non-scientific audience. I guess this emerged because because the way that people tend to first encounter science is, apart from press releases or newspaper articles, is the scientific abstract. Now, scientific abstracts are great, but they're written with a scientific audience in mind. So my thoughts were, is there a way of maybe writing a poem that would instead get people to engage with the science and to find out more about it? And I started this blog about a decade ago. It makes me very old. And I think I used to get like 2 people reading it a month, my mum and this random Russian bot. And then I think I have like about 100,000 views a year now. So it's just persistence, I guess. And then also please check out my blog. Don't look at anything older than 4 or 5 years ago, because the poetry is objectively terrible. And I guess what I used to try to do was try to didactically explain the science through very labored rhymes. Whereas actually what I then realized was that if instead I did like kind of a non-specialist summary of the research in a couple of paragraphs, the poem itself could then offer an alternative lens through which to view the science, so that instead of being like a direct representation of the research, it got people thinking about what it meant and to contextualize it. And then what this meant was that as well as being of interest to a non-scientific audience, it also became of interest to a scientific audience as well, because there's a different way to view that research. I have an accompanying podcast as well. The blog tends to go out on a Thursday. This morning I just posted, and the podcast tends to go out on a Monday. I guess probably a good idea to show what this looks like in practice. So I don't know if people saw this paper a few weeks ago. It was amazing. So it was in Science Advances, so open access, free to read. And I mean, the title kind of says what it needs to do, that crows recognize geometric regularity. So basically, this research tested to see if crows could identify different geometric shapes. And the answer was yes, which is amazing. And also like just being really cool. But then it's quite profound, really, because it kind of challenges that, I guess, the ideology that humans are at the top of the intellectual hierarchy, and that actually intellect and cognitive abilities also exist on the spectrum. So this is the abstract, which is pretty good. Like, well, as a scientific abstract, it's really good. Like, it explains what the research was, what the findings were, it contextualizes it. Our findings suggest that geometric intuitions are not specific to humans, but are deeply rooted in biological evolution. I mean, that's amazing. But it also contains a lot of language that maybe non-scientists might not be familiar with. So what is elementary Euclidean geometry, for example? And so I'll take you through the process. So what I do is I kind of rewrite the abstract for non-scientists, and then off the back of that, I write a poem. So this is how I rewrite the abstract. Many people naturally notice when a shape looks regular, with features like straight lines, right angles, or symmetry, and this is often seen as a uniquely human skill. But research with carrion crows suggests otherwise. In tests, the crows quickly learned to spot an odd shape that was slightly different from the rest, and they did even better when the shapes followed clear patterns like symmetry. They did not need to be taught this, suggesting that the ability to recognize regular shapes might be something animals share with us, rather than a skill we only learn through schooling. This challenges the idea that math and geometry are purely human ways of seeing the world. So, in a way, I've done lots of the heavy lifting of trying to explain it through the text there. And then this is the poem that I wrote to accompany it. A notch in the sky's lattice, 6 shapes pause while one turns away. It does not take a name to know what fits, what leans too far from the bone script of edge meet and mirror mark. Wing watcher, line knower. It sees what we forget before we learn to measure. There is no trick to the seeing, just a long thread of pattern wound tighter than thought. And yeah, I mean, my poetry is okay. You don't. My poetry doesn't need to be celebrated, but it serves this purpose of trying to communicate science to a non-scientific audience. Again, in this one-way exchange of ideas. Where I think poetry is most powerful is in developing dialogue. So this two-way exchange of information. I just want to, I guess, take a step back a little bit more on what do I mean by that. It's probably best given with an example. Now, imagine that you are designing flood risk mitigation strategies. So ways of, I guess, mitigating or alleviating flood in a locality like a town or a city. Now, as a scientist, you would go out and you would take water table measurements, you'd look at satellite data, you'd look at flood risks, you'd look at floodplains, you'd look at the structure of the buildings and the infrastructure you're trying to create. But what you should also do is talk to the people that live there. And you shouldn't do this just because it's a box ticking exercise, but you should do it because it's a data set, right? These people have lived there maybe for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And even though they might not be flood experts, they have knowledge and lived experience and tacit expertise that can feed into your work. So they will know in far more granularity evidences of floods that have happened. They will know areas that are maybe more prone to flooding than others. They will be aware of certain people or communities that are more, I guess, welcoming of proposed flood risk mitigation strategies. But you won't find that out unless you ask them. And the problem that we then have in trying to engage non-scientists and scientists in this two-way exchange of information is something that I call the hierarchy of intellect. So it's this idea that even with very non-patronizing, super engaged, empathetic scientists, non-scientists might feel to themselves, well, oh, that person's a doctor or a professor, or they've got 10 letters after their name. Like, who am I to comment on this? And so what we need to do is we need to try to level those hierarchies of intellect, perceived or otherwise. And one of the ways, and the way in which I do this, is through poetry. So what we do is we bring together scientists and non-scientists, and we write poetry together, and we use that as a starting point for dialogue. And this works for multiple reasons. First of all, it gives permission to the non-scientists, because when you write a poem, you're then sharing the poem rather than sharing any scientific point of view that you might have. So it becomes slightly more enabling. 2, it gives permission to the scientists to display an element of pathos or emotion with their work that they're not normally allowed to do. So when you're talking about the objectivity of your research findings, sometimes we're not always encouraged as scientists to become emotional. But I don't know how you can talk about like floods or the climate crisis without getting angry or upset or fearful. So by creating a poem, it enables the scientists to display that level of emotion that they're not normally allowed to do. And then thirdly, it creates a safe space for vulnerability. So this idea that once you've seen a learned professor or a research scientist read a poorly constructed sonnet or a dirty limerick or something like that, you realize that actually it's not science and non-science, it's just society. And here's a couple of examples of research papers where we did this. And a lot of the work that I do is working with marginalized and underserved audiences. So refugees, asylum seekers, people who identify as living with severe mental health needs, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And there's one poem that always sticks out for me. So we went to go and do a session with people living in inner city Manchester, who lived in one of the most polluted areas in the country. And we wanted to talk to them about air pollution. And so we went and started talking to them, and lots of them didn't even know what it was, let alone that they were affected by it. So we had a chat, and then I asked them to write poems about their experiences. And one of them just wrote this 5-line poem. I've never seen pollution, never noticed it. It's always been here, but I'm unaware of it. Just breathing it in. And for me, that those 5 lines, like the Browskin piece, like they just cut through to the experience in such a profound manner. And this, is very affecting for the scientists in the room, because they realized that, the work that they were doing is not data sets, it's people. And, this then led to lots of positive conversations and opportunities for future research direction, and actually the beginnings of some policy changes in Manchester with regards to air pollution and the way it's communicated as well. And then finally on to, I guess, participation. And I would say this is probably the area that in my own work, in terms of actually using poetry as a tool for participation in scientific research, probably needs a little bit more development. And one of the most powerful ways to do it is probably through that science and policy nexus. But one thing that has been really successful in terms of participation is working with scientists and non-scientists as well, to encourage them to express their poetic and artistic side. And I'm sure for many people on this talk, as scientists, you have other interests and skills as well. And I think about my own, I guess, compulsory education. The UK is slightly different from the US, and it's much more narrow. You kind of choose your subject areas when you're 14, and then that decides your remit for you. And so, I was always just maths, chemistry, physics, but I'd always been really interested in being a poet. And, speaking to colleagues and scientists, I knew that there were many talented poets and artists as well. So about 5 years ago now, we set up Consilience. And Consilience is the world's first peer-reviewed science and poetry and art journal. So what we tried to do is we tried to take the peer review model and apply it to poetry and art. So, as people know, peer review in scientific research, you send your work in, it goes out to 2 or 3 independent reviewers, they give their comments, and then an associate handling editor uses those comments to hopefully work with the author in a way of developing the work and the author themselves. And, when it works, this is a really positive and supportive process, and actually very different to how poetry journals normally operate, which is you submit your work and it's either accepted or rejected, and that's it. So what we wanted to do was, even despite the subjectivity of poetry and art, we wanted to do this thing where people submitted their work, and we gave most people the opportunity to have their work sent out to reviewers, who then independently reviewed the work, the poems or the arts, the artistic, the artwork, and then send it on to a handling editor, and then that handling editor liaised with the poet or the author. And we're now a team of 86 volunteers across 6 continents, just missing Antarctica. Since we started, we've published over 400 poets and artists, and the website last year had 90,000 views, which for a poetry journal is wild. What I would say is, you're very welcome to join us, to submit work to us. We have 4 issues a year. That's the website, that's the QR code. And people are welcome to join us, as well as reviewers or editors. No previous experience needed, just We're a friendly community, very bottom up, is completely volunteer led. And yeah, we welcome people to join us in that process. And from a couple of messages I've had in the chat, there's already a couple of people in here who've already been part of that process, which is wonderful. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is a poem in the last issue of Change. This is written by Nicholas Hogg. It's called Entropy. You planted fruit trees in pots, apple, plum, pear to see in the spring with blossom and the promise of a crop, where you sit with a book in the April sun, leaning on a wall that radiates heat like a fire in a hearth. Picture the roots in watered soil expanding into dark, how the photons journey from a dying star, energize a leaf, illuminate a page. We read in haste, later when the setting sun dips and the flames expire. And then another way we participate is we have this, last year we had our inaugural Brilliant Poetry competition. So this is run with an organisation called The Brilliant, which helps to platform science communication and science communicators across the world. Last year we had 375 entries across 36 countries with over £1,500 in prizes. And if you follow that QR code, it will take you through to this year's competition, which is run in collaboration with AAS and is also part of the International Year of the Quantum. So if you've got any poems that feature quantum, please submit your work this year in either English or Spanish or French. And again, up to over £1,500 in total prize money is available. I think I'll just leave that for now. And then just going back to what I said, challenging myself here, I think we could be doing more here in terms of participation. And actually, one of the most powerful ways to do this is through policy. And actually, in those dialogues with scientists and non-scientists, inviting policymakers into that process as well, so they can be part of that dialogue, and then also that can lead to direct action, which has been directed by the communities themselves as well. And then, yeah, one of the last things I want to finish on, I guess I just want to give everyone a tool to take away with them, and this is using poetry to problem solve. So, you know, when you have like a problem either in the lab or in the classroom, and you can't work out a solution to it, so you know instinctively to walk away from it. You know, close your laptop, end the field work, whatever, and then like maybe a few hours or a day or a week later, you're making dinner, stepping into the shower, getting onto the train, and the solution comes to you because it's kind of been percolating in your subconscious. But that's a very passive way of targeting that particular way to problem solve. So instead, I offer you a creative way to target the incubation period, and that is to write a poem about it. So the next time you have a problem or an issue, write a poem about it. And you won't come necessarily with a direct solution, but it will make you think about it in a different way. And this is what I do when I have a problem at work. I'll just stop and take a poem, write a poem about it. And the way that I start is by writing a list poem. So we're all going to write some list poems now. So if you get your writing implements, you can use pen and paper, or you can use your laptop or a mobile phone, whatever you want. I'm just going to give you a prompt. I want you to write for 40 seconds until I say stop. You can write in bullet points, you can write in Joycean sentences, you can write however you want to. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. I'll talk over the top so it's not awkward, and people who are watching this recording, you know, just please feel free to join in. So when I say go, I want you to write list all the things that are in your room. Go. So you can list all the things that you can see, all the things that you can smell, all the things that you can hear, all the things that you can touch, all the things you can taste. You can list people in your room, objects in your room, places in your room. Be slightly more metaphysical and talk about ideas or ideologies or feelings or emotions or memories. Got about 10 seconds left. Just keep writing. There's no right or wrong way. We're not going to share this with anyone, so it's just for you. 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay, very great. We're going to do the same exercise, but I want to list all the things that are out of a window. And go. So if you're in a room without a window, very sorry, it sounds depressing, but just imagine that there's a window in the wall. So what are you looking at? What can you see? What can you hear? Look outside my window, I can see, blue skies with beautiful white clouds and a gorgeous cherry tree that's in my front garden. I can just see the leaves off and some nesting. What do they look like? I don't know. I've got some pheasants and partridges in my garden. So but that's my garden. You've got about 5 seconds left. Just keep writing. 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay, and then the final one, I want you to list all the things that you associate with the word science. Go. And this can be a very cathartic exercise. It can be positive things, it can be negative things, it can be people, it can be places, it can be memories, it can be equations, it can be ideas, it can be theorems, it can be hypotheses, whatever you want. And again, it can be positive. I'd say if you've been very literal up until now, I encourage you to be a slightly bit more metaphorical or playful. And likewise, if you've been very metaphorical and playful, maybe you could be a little bit more literal. I've got about 5 seconds left. 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, so what I do then is when I have a problem, I just do this exercise. I give myself a minute. I write down everything about the problem, just without thinking about it, just get it all down. And then I've got a word bank. And then I use that word bank to start to craft a poem with. And then it just forces me to engage with the problem in a slightly different way. So the key messages I guess I want to communicate today is that science communication exists as a spectrum, a non-hierarchical spectrum. So we have dissemination, the exchange, one-way exchange of ideas from a scientific to a non-scientific audience. We have dialogue, so this two-way exchange of ideas to help to develop scientific discourse. And we have participation, which is when non-scientists are actually involved in the scientific research as well. Poetry is effective at communicating science to an audience. In terms of that one-way exchange of information. And poetry, I would say, is most powerful as a medium to help platform voices, to really help to level those hierarchies and to develop dialogue. And then finally, poetry can help to actively target the incubation period and help to solve problems as well. If you want more information about this, I wrote several books about this, but I've written a book called Science Communication Through Poetry, which you can follow via that QR code, which just really looks at how we might use poetry to communicate science. And then a book that came out earlier this year, The Poetry of Physics from a Quark to a Quasar, which just features a selection of physics poems that I've written inspired by scientific research, and it's fairly reasonably priced because it's a trade book. And again, feel free to follow that QR code and don't just listen to me, listen to Professor Dame Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, who tells you that it's great, which is very nice. And then, yeah, finally, I had quite a gloomy poetic abstract, so I'll finish with a slightly more positive poetic conclusion. So this is a poem by Rebecca Elson, who was a Canadian astronomer and poet who did a lot of work on the first Hubble Space Telescope, and who wrote this poem called We Astronomers. We astronomers are nomads, merchants, circus people, all the earth our tent. We are industrious, we breed enthusiasms, honour our responsibility to awe. But the universe has moved a long way off. Sometimes I confess starlight seems too sharp, and like the moon I bend my face to the ground, the small patch where each foot falls. Before it falls, and I forget to ask questions and only count things. And for me, it's a beautiful poem for many reasons. Like, we are nomads, merchants, circus people. We have a responsibility to awe. And also those last lines are just such a powerful mantra for me. Sometimes when we're doing scientific research or we're thinking about science, we can get so caught up in the miniature that sometimes it really helps to take a step back and to think of the bigger picture and the bigger questions that we're helping to contribute to. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop my presentation now, but I'm happy to take questions until the hour, and please do feel free to follow up via email or via social media as well. And thank you very much for listening.